The slam of my mailbox echoed through the quiet suburban street. It was the kind of sound that made my stomach drop, because it almost always meant one thing: another letter from the Pinecrest Village HOA. Sure enough, when I pulled the envelope out, I saw their familiar, bold-lettered logo glaring back at me like an accusation. With a sigh, I tore it open, standing on my driveway. Notice of violation. Amount due, $55. My brow furrowed. $55? For what? My eyes scanned down the page until I found it. Grass exceeding height regulations by 0.5 inches. I nearly choked. Half an inch? This had to be a joke. My shifts at the hospital had been brutal lately. Between taking care of my daughter, Lily, who had asthma, and barely managing bills ever since my husband walked out, the last thing on my mind was whether my lawn was a fraction of an inch too long. Across the street, Sandra Wilkins stood watering her perfectly trimmed rose bushes. The moment she saw me looking, she smirked and turned away. Of course, Sandra. She was the HOA's self-appointed enforcer, the type to measure grass with a ruler and report anything out of place. I crumpled the letter in frustration and threw it onto my growing pile of unpaid bills. I didn't have time for this nonsense, but I should have known the HOA wasn't done with me yet. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, flipping through my checkbook and medical bills, trying to figure out how to stretch my paycheck. Lily's inhalers and nebulizer meds weren't cheap, even with insurance. I barely scraped by each month as it was. Then my phone rang. Pinecrest Village, HOA. This is Carol. Hi, Carol. I just got a fine for my grass being half an inch too tall. That seems excessive, don't you think? I wasn't even warned. A long, exaggerated sigh came from the other end of the line. According to our updated bylaws, we no longer issue warnings before fines. Updated? I asked, confused. I never signed anything. The board approved new regulations last month. An email was sent out. After hanging up, I dug through my inbox until I found it. An unread 47-page PDF buried in my spam folder. Scanning through, my stomach twisted. They had slipped in dozens of new rules, all designed to fine homeowners over minor infractions. And the worst part? The HOA president, Richard Walters, had complete control over where the fine money went. Something wasn't right. I had a sinking feeling this was about to get a lot worse. The next morning, my neighbor Marcus, an older man who had lived in Pinecrest Village for 20 years, knocked on my door. He leaned on his cane, shaking his head. "Sandra's on a warpath," he muttered. "She got me last week for leaving my trash can out 4 hours too long. Cost me $75. "That's insane," I said. "How can they keep raising these fines?" Been worse since Walters took over. Rumor is he's using our money to fund some fancy clubhouse renovation. I clenched my jaw. They were stealing from us. Over the next 3 days, the fines started piling up. First, it was another $75 for unauthorized garden structures, a small wooden trellis in my backyard. Then, a $50 charge for improper storage of recreational equipment. Lily's bike had been in the front yard for a few hours. The fines were adding up fast. And I wasn't the only one. At the next HOA meeting, a dozen neighbors whispered to me about similar horror stories. But when I demanded to see the HOA's financial records, Walters dodged a question. "You can review them by appointment," he said, smirking. The next day, when I showed up at the HOA office to demand answers, I found a handwritten note taped to the door. "Closed for emergency maintenance." How convenient. This wasn't just petty enforcement anymore. This was a power trip. And I was their next target. I wasn't backing down. I called Amir, my neighbor who was also an attorney. After reviewing my pile of violation notices, his frown deepened. "This is harassment," he said. "The fines are arbitrary, and they're escalating them intentionally. So what do I do?" "Document everything. Take photos, timestamps, and save all communications. And if they refuse financial transparency, they might be breaking the law." But before I could act, Sandra escalated the fight. One morning, as I was making breakfast, I spotted her standing in my front yard, taking pictures of my house with a professional camera. I stormed outside. Excuse me? What do you think you're doing? She didn't even flinch, documenting ongoing violations. For what? She smirked. Your holiday lights are still on your back patio. That's another fine. But then her camera lens moved toward my front door, where Lily was standing. Something inside me snapped. You do not photograph my child. I stepped between them, blocking her shot. Sandra sneered. Your emotional outburst is disturbing the peace. That's another violation. I was done playing defense. That's when I made the call that would change everything. Jenna, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, can you do a segment on HOAs abusing their power? Because I have a story for you. Jenna Rivera, my cousin and an investigative reporter for Channel 7, didn't hesitate. I'm in. By that afternoon, Jenna was on my front porch, taking notes as I laid out everything. The fines, the harassment, the refusal to show financial records. This is bigger than just you, she said. HOAs abuse their power all the time, but most homeowners are too scared to fight back. She looked around, eyes sharp. What's your next move? I have a hearing with the HOA board on Tuesday. Walters thinks he can intimidate me into backing down. Jenna smiled. Then let's make sure he doesn't see what's coming. I didn't know it yet, but that meeting and the live TV broadcast that followed would be the beginning of the end for Pinecrest Village's corrupt HOA, because they had messed with the wrong homeowner. The morning after Jenna left, I felt something was off the moment I stepped onto my porch. The air was too still, the neighborhood too quiet. Then my phone buzzed with an email notification. Subject: Notice of new violations. Immediate action required. I groaned, opening the message. Unauthorized garden structures, $75. Failure to store recreational equipment, $50. Disrupting neighborhood aesthetic, $100. My fingers tightened around my phone. They had tripled my fines overnight. I stormed to my driveway and saw Sandra standing by her mailbox, watching me. She gave a little wave and a satisfied smirk. That's when it hit me. They weren't just trying to find me into submission. They were piling on violations to justify something bigger. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. I needed to get ahead of this. I texted Jenna. They just issued 3 more fines. They're up to something. Her reply came fast. Get everything in writing. I'm digging into HOA laws today. Call me if things escalate. I didn't know it yet, but things were about to escalate faster than I ever imagined. That afternoon, as I sat at the kitchen table documenting my violations, my doorbell rang. It was Amir, my lawyer neighbor. I've been researching, he said, stepping inside. What they're doing isn't just unethical, it might be illegal. I leaned in. How illegal? HOAs can enforce bylaws, but they can't selectively target homeowners or issue fines without due process. There are state protections against this kind of abuse. I exhaled in relief. So we can fight this? Yes, Amir said, but his face darkened. But they know the legal gray areas. It won't be easy. I nodded. I don't care how hard it is. They're messing with the wrong homeowner. Then, as if on cue, a black Mercedes pulled up outside. Richard Walters. The HOA president stepped out, straightening his expensive suit. His face was a mask of confidence as he strutted toward my house. Miss Thompson, he said smoothly, I was just stopping by to discuss your growing list of violations. I crossed my arms. Funny, I was just discussing your growing list of financial inconsistencies. His smile faltered for half a second. Then he pulled an official-looking envelope from his jacket and handed it to me. Final notice. Pay all outstanding fines within 48 hours or face escalated consequences. I scanned the page. My fines now totaled $310. My hands shook with anger. This is harassment. Walters sighed, feigning disappointment. Miss Thompson, the board expects compliance from all homeowners. You've been particularly difficult. I clenched my jaw. Have a good day, he said, turning back toward his car. As he drove away, I felt it in my gut. The worst was yet to come. The next day, I came home late from work, exhausted and drenched in sweat from the summer heat. But something felt wrong as I walked up my porch steps. My house was too dark. I reached for the light switch. Nothing. I frowned and tried again. Still nothing. A sick realization settled in my stomach. I grabbed my phone and called the power company. After navigating the automated system, I finally reached a rep. "Miss Thompson," the woman said, "your service was disconnected today at the request of Pinecrest Village Homeowners Association." I froze. "What?" My voice shook. "They can't do that." The woman hesitated. "According to their utility oversight agreement, they have the authority to suspend services due to unresolved violations." My refrigerator was off. Lily's asthma medication was inside. The heat inside my house was already unbearable, and it was going to get worse. I called Walters. Voicemail. I called Sandra. No answer. I called the HOA emergency line. "Your request will be processed within 24 or 48 hours. My hands shook with rage. Then I saw it. Movement behind Sandra's curtains. I turned my phone flashlight on and aimed it toward her house. She was watching me, and she was smiling. That's when my anger turned to determination. They thought they could bully me into submission. They thought I'd just take it. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. I dialed Jenna. She picked up immediately. They cut my power. A pause. Then, "I'm on my way." 30 minutes later, the Channel 7 News van pulled up in front of my house. Jenna jumped out, microphone in hand. Her camera crew followed. She took one look at my darkened house and turned to the camera. "We're broadcasting this live." My heart pounded. "What? Right now?" "Yes, right now." She gestured to my dark house. "This isn't just about HOA abuse anymore. They put a child's health at risk." The camera light blinked on. Jenna turned to face it. "This is Jenna Rivera with Channel 7 News, reporting live from Pinecrest Village, where a single mother's power was cut off by our own Homeowners Association." I glanced towards Sandra's house. Her curtains snapped shut. Walters was about to lose control of his perfect little neighborhood. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I knew I was going to win. 10 minutes into the live broadcast, the neighborhood started gathering outside my house. People murmured to each other. Someone shouted, "Wait, they can do that." Another voice, "They try to fine me $200 for having wind chimes." Then, headlights appeared down the street. A silver Mercedes. Walters. Jenna's eyes lit up. "Looks like we got company." As Walters stepped out of his car, Jenna turned the camera on him. "Mr. Walters," she said smoothly, "care to explain why your HOA cut the power to a single mother's home over a disputed $55 fine?" His face paled. I crossed my arms. He tried to smile, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "No comment," he muttered. Jenna pressed forward. "Are you aware that state law requires a 7-day written notice before utility shut off?" The neighbors erupted into gasps and murmurs. The news crew caught it all. I could see it in Walter's eyes. He knew he was cornered. And this was just the beginning. The tension in the air was electric. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before were stepping forward, one by one, their anger growing with every new revelation. Maria, who lived at the end of the street, crossed her arms and glared at Walters. "You fined me $100 because my son's soccer ball was left on our lawn overnight. Do you call that maintaining property values?" Jason's father stepped forward. "You fined me for having an unauthorized gathering when I invited my son's Little League team over for pizza after they won a game." Mrs. Jenkins, who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years, shook her head. "You fined me $75 because my wind chimes disrupted the uniform appearance of the community." One by one, the stories piled up, exposing years of unjust HOA rule. The news crew caught every word. Walters visibly shrank, adjusting his tie like it might save him. Sandra was nowhere to be seen. She had vanished into her house the moment the cameras started rolling. Then, from the back of the crowd, a new voice called out, "Where's the money, Walters?" Silence fell. Maria stepped forward again, her voice sharp. "Yeah, if you're so obsessed with community standards, why haven't we seen a single improvement with all the fines you collected?" A murmur spread through the crowd. Jenna pounced on it immediately. "Great question, Mr. Walters. Would you care to share the HOA's financial records?" His jaw tightened. He knew he was trapped, but he still tried to weasel his way out. "Those records are private. They're accessible only by appointment through the HOA office." Jenna raised an eyebrow, which has been mysteriously closed for maintenance. Every time Rachel tried to see them, the neighbors weren't buying it. Walters turned on his heel, trying to escape, but he was about to realize he had nowhere left to run. Amir stepped forward, holding a thick folder. "Actually," he said, loud enough for the cameras to hear, "we already have your financial records." Walters froze. Jenna's eyes lit up. "Let's take a look." Amir opened the folder and began reading aloud. Over the past 2 years, administrative expenses increased by 340%. Gasps spread through the crowd. Maria's husband, an accountant, spoke up. "That's impossible. The HOA doesn't have that many expenses." Amir continued reading. An additional $300,000 was allocated for landscaping services to a company called Evergreen Solutions. Jason frowned. "I've lived here for 5 years. The landscaping hasn't changed at all." Amir nodded. "That's because Evergreen Solutions doesn't exist." He pulled out another document. "It's a shell company registered to Richard Walters' brother-in-law." The crowd erupted. Jenna turned back to Walters. "So tell us, Mr. Walters, why is HOA money disappearing into a fake company?" Walters turned pale. He took a step back, looking toward his car, as if he could still escape. But it was too late. A black sedan pulled up, and 2 men in suits stepped out. County investigators. They had been watching the live broadcast. One of them flashed a badge. "Richard Walters, we have some questions for you." The crowd cheered as Walters was escorted away. But it wasn't over yet. By the next morning, the scandal had gone viral. Jenna's story was running on every major news channel, exposing Pinecrest Village as one of the worst HOA corruption cases in the state. Emails flooded my inbox. People from across the country sharing their own HOA horror stories, thanking me for fighting back. Then, the mayor herself called me. "Miss Thompson," she said, "I've directed the city attorney's office to conduct a full audit of Pinecrest Village HOA. The fraud charges against Walters are just the beginning." I exhaled, shaking with relief. That evening, I stood on my porch, looking out at my neighborhood. For the first time in months, it felt different. It felt like we had won. The HOA was in shambles. With Walters under investigation and Sandra nowhere to be found, the board was forced to hold an emergency meeting. The community center was packed. Judge Reynolds, our retired local judge, stood at the front. "We will now vote to remove the remaining board members and appoint a new, temporary HOA leadership team." The votes came in fast and unanimous. The new board? Maria, Jason, Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Patel, and Judge Reynolds himself. The first action on the new board, refunding all unfair fines. The second, eliminating the HOA's ability to cut off utilities. The third, launching a full financial audit to recover the stolen money. When the meeting ended, the entire neighborhood broke into applause. A weight that had suffocated us for years had finally been lifted. But what happened next? That was the most unexpected part of all. A few days later, I opened my front door to find a potted plant sitting on my porch. A small note was tucked into the soil. "For your garden, better days ahead." The Johnsons. Tears stung my eyes. I walked outside, and that's when I saw it. Something incredible happening in the neighborhood. Dozens of neighbors were working together, planting trees, trimming hedges, painting fences. Maria smiled as she shoveled dirt into a new flower bed. We figured if we all helped each other, we wouldn't need an HOA to tell us what our yard should look like. Jason laughed. "It's amazing what happens when people actually work together instead of just finding each other." Even Mr. Finnegan, our most reclusive neighbor, was out pruning roses. I stood there, taking it all in. This was what a neighborhood was supposed to be. Not rules, not punishments. People. That night, Jenna sat beside me on my porch swing, watching the impromptu block party unfold. She nudged me. "You know, your story aired nationally yesterday. People all over the country are asking how you fought back." I smiled. "Tell them I didn't fight alone." As the stars blinked overhead and the hum of laughter filled the air, I realized something. I had lost power once. But now, I had more power than I ever imagined. And this time, it wasn't about electricity. It was about community.